We are here with my friend Sven Sundgaard, who is somebody who people all around the community know you pretty well, Sven. Many, many years on television, but also as somebody who's been a meteorologist and a scientist, and I would say also somebody who's been a real guiding light for those of us who want to bring the message about climate change and urgency forward. So it's really a pleasure to be with you today.
Pleasure to be here.
I should have mentioned your most important credential, which is you're a science advisor to the Minneapolis Foundation's Climate Reaction Series, which is our series on the intersection of climate and equity. And thank you for really putting together some great videos for us that really help people walk into this issue that's complicated and also as simple as saving the planet.
So happy to do it, and very happy that you and other organizations are really taking an initiative to do something about this, and on a local level too, because I think people think big picture all the time with climate change, which it is, but we got to think about these local issues too, and there's adaptation, and then there's also prevention. You know, it's multifaceted, as you know.
One of the things I want to start with is, what is it going to take to raise a generation that understands science in the depth that this next generation is going to have to? I might add that this current generation hasn't done a good enough job at. And I say that to you not only because of just your general interest in climate, but you've really done some really interesting work. I've followed you as a person giving the weather, but I remember a series you did called Strictly Science, which was you explaining science to kids, never talking down to them, but helping to distill this. Can you start with how you got interested in this as a kid, and then as you tried to bring that onto television, how do we talk to our kids about science without scaring the heck out of them about what's going on, but have them understand urgency?
Yeah, that's a good question that I don't think anybody has a full answer to, but we got to start somewhere and try. And the thing I like about talking to kids is they're genuinely curious. They don't know a lot. You're kind of starting with a blank slate, and they're just fascinated by whatever you're telling them. You know, like when you tell an 8-year-old for the first time the speed of light and talk about how light moves way faster than sound, and you can use the example of lightning and thunder, they're mesmerized. You know, it's move over, Santa Claus, who cares? I mean, that's cool. And the thing about, you know, igniting the interest in youth is that can lead to a career, or maybe them being more involved in something in science anyway. And, you know, besides climate change, you know, one of the big issues has been getting more women and people of color into the science fields, and this is a way to do that, you know, instill that interest. You know, at a young age, you don't know yet, you haven't been told or taught yet that you can't do the things that society, you know, historically has said, no, you can't do that. You know, that's not in your realm because of the color of your skin or your sex or the income that your family has. So, you know, all the possibilities are open. And, you know, to get to the climate change thing, I think this generation growing up now really gets it. Whether I've taught, you know, I taught at a private school, but I've, you know, part of the job of being a TV meteorologist was going to schools routinely and talking about weather. And I would talk about weather, but increasingly over the years, I made my talks specifically about climate change because I knew that they were getting general weather information in school, but climate change is the thing that a lot of schools are trying to struggle really with. How do we teach that and keep up to date on it? You know, it's not like the algebra book you can have that was, you know, I don't know about you, but when I went to school, every book we had was like 30 years old. Right. And I liked looking through the names in the front and say, oh, look, you know, Shannon had this book in 1979. And here I am 20 years later using the same book. You can't have a textbook on climate change unless you're revising it every year. And of course, schools would have a hard time paying for that. So, yeah, I just think they're receptive. They know that this is an issue that they're going to have to deal with. And, you know, I routinely say, you know, as these things come out, that when they grow up, they're going to be not very pleased with their, you know, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents generation, because this is not something that's popped up. You know, the alarm bells have been there for decades, and we've just wasted so much critical time that the mess is going to be bigger, and unfortunately, they're going to have to do a lot more work in a shorter period of time because of our inaction for the last few decades.
Let's flip that generational piece, because, you know, I think I would imagine you're in some of the conversations I'm in where people say, well, we've really messed this thing up, but oh, isn't it wonderful? This generation is coming up that's going to do so much. As if you'd take your house that's falling down and needs a new boiler and throw the keys to the kids and say, fix this for me. Adults, often, I think right now, clueless about this. What is some of the insight you have about how to walk people into this conversation who maybe, care about it, but need to understand the incredible urgency of this? How do you get them clarity on what actually is going on?
Yeah, I mean, because you're right. We don't just have to hand this off to the next generation and say, oh, we messed it up and, oh, well, no, because there's stuff that we can do now. And actually, there is stuff that we have to do right now in these next 5 to 10 years. I think everybody has understood, the point has been made increasingly clear that we have to take really bold action and quickly to really prevent some of the most catastrophic scenarios that the IPCC has outlined and others. And I think we have to keep pounding home the idea that this really is a priority, because you'll see things ranked, whenever the polls are done. And, finally we're at a point now where I think it's 60% of Americans realize climate change is an issue. It's taken a long time to get there. And I think us in Australia, of the industrialized countries, have always been drug kicking and screaming, but we're finally there. But you always see economy, whatever else, unfortunately, the state of democracy, it's a big deal right now. But we need to prioritize climate change more and realize that all those other issues that you think are more important, maybe this election cycle, are tied into climate change, because this is going to get worse. California, it was nice to see climate change routinely ranking high on their list for the governor's recall election, because they're on fire right now, and their fire season is way worse than it ever used to be, and it's not going to get better. And I think people are seeing enough local disasters in their own communities. They're kind of everywhere in the country this year. Really, for the first summer ever, everybody experienced some form of a climate change disaster, undeniably made worse because of what we've done to the planet. And so, I mean, it sounds bad, but I'm hoping Mother Nature sent a message to a lot of people this year, so that in the next year or two, when we have more elections, because that's the number one thing I tell people who feel powerless: vote for the people. It doesn't matter what party they're in. Unfortunately, it's become that most people who care about this issue now are in one party, but it didn't used to be that way, as you know. George H.W. Bush, Nixon. I mean, Nixon looks like a hippie now for all the stuff he did in the 70s. Clean Air and Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, all these things. We just need to get back to that, everybody coming together and realizing this is a big deal that we have to fix. And we don't want to pass this off to it kind of becomes, any politician in their last term, you start to think about legacy, right? Well, we have to think about this as legacy, that we will be judged in the future, just like we look back at some of the founding fathers and be like, well, how did you have slaves? How did you weasel your way around thinking that was okay? And because you had to struggle with that somehow in your head at some point. We don't want the future to look back and say, what were they thinking? I mean, the world was on fire all around them. How did they justify not doing anything?
Step on that one for a second, because that's such a good analogy. How could the founding fathers have possibly written a document that was so visionary, with the idea that it didn't extend to everybody? I mean, now it's so clear. What is it right now? And I mean, obviously, you're not going to solve it. Everybody can. But what is that blind spot that you've been in so many places where you're trying to explain this to folks and they shut down and all that? How do you think people get to that point, and how do we get them beyond that?
I think whenever we're in denial of something, it's because we don't want to have to do the hard work to fix it.
Right.
The people who realize climate change maybe is an issue but continue to deny it, you're either an oil executive, which is obviously a slim minority of people, right, or you're just like, I don't want to have. If we realize this is a thing, we're the cause, we have to fix it, and I don't want to do the work. It's the same thing with coming to terms with systemic racism in our country. If we acknowledge it's a problem in the history, then we have to do the work to untangle it. And there's a lot of people don't want to have to think of that. I'm not involved. It wasn't me. It was somebody else. And let's just move on.
I've sort of had this thought that there's also an element to this that it's difficult for a lot of people to understand a global catastrophe in which it wouldn't be just my city or my state or my country, but the whole world going through it at once. And then all of a sudden along comes COVID. Okay, so we've gotten a pretty darn good understanding over the past year and a half about what a global crisis gets to be. And I hold out a certain amount of hope that in a strange and bizarre way, we now can envision catastrophe, and the only difference is there is no inoculation for this one.
Yeah, I agree, and you know, that's part of the thing that, to that point, you know, when everybody talked about, oh, we need to get every American vaccinated, we're like, well, we could get every American vaccinated, but if the rest of the world, you know, talk about some of the countries in South Africa, Namibia, I think in South Africa, and those are some of the better off countries in Africa, are at 5 to 10% vaccination. Well, as long as that exists, that just is going to allow, you know, we've seen how quick this virus mutates and how increasingly other variants are going to be resistant to the vaccine. So it doesn't matter until we're all in it together. And it is a similar thing to climate change, you know. And to that point, in Minnesota, it's easier to say, well, we don't have to worry about sea level rise or maybe being on fire as much as California, although we saw that Minnesota can be on fire too. Yeah. But we actually do fare a little bit better in a warmer world than coastal regions or areas that are in desert areas of Southern Africa, Australia, that are just going to get even drier. But it is going to be our problem at some point when we have climate refugees and other things, and you know, in an unstable world. You know, this, people don't think about the picture of how famine will lead to war and all sorts of other things that we can't just isolate ourselves from at some point. And we don't want to have to get to that point where we have to figure out how to inoculate ourselves, right, or try to fix that. It's easier to prevent it than to fix it.
You're talking about the world. A lot of us can talk about the world. You've actually traveled the world, looking at what's happening in animal populations and others. In this series we're doing at the Minneapolis Foundation about climate reaction, we're looking at this intersection of climate and equity. One of the things that we'll say that seems pretty abstract to people is there are going to be a lot of climate refugees. You just mentioned that. Take us to one of these places around the world you've been and help us put a face on that. Who's going to be a climate refugee, and what is that going to mean?
Some of it's obvious. You know, if you live in Bangladesh, for example, and you're at sea level, and you know they get monsoon seasons, a normal part of their weather, that they get flooding, but that's going to get worse along with sea level rise and stronger, more intense storms that are producing even more rainfall and flooding. Those people are going to have to go somewhere. We know that that's already an unsettled part of the world. You've got India, Pakistan, China, Bangladesh, all kind of fighting over same resources. So that's a little more obvious. Some of it, though, is, you know, think of a lot of Central and Southern Africa depends on agriculture. And we know that Botswana, Namibia, parts of South Africa, places that I've been to multiple times, is really at some of the highest risk of climate change, because these are dry areas that have rainy and dry seasons. You know, we think of 4 seasons in Minnesota. There, they really only have 2. Hot and dry, or really hot and wet. And those rainy seasons are less and less dependable. They can go whole seasons with almost no rainfall now. Parts of Namibia recently had a 5-year drought where there were parts of that country that didn't have a drop of rain for 5 years. Well, what are those people going to do? These are societies that depend on agriculture. And so part of what we have to do, the richer countries of the world, is find ways to help these people economically so that they aren't refugees, because then it becomes everybody's problem at some point anyway. And that goes to, you know, you hear a lot about, well, why should we do this if China's not going to do this, and India's not going to do this, and Africa is not going to do this? Well, the developing countries in the world have every right to say, well, you guys got to develop on all this dirty energy. Right. Well, why can't we? Or you need to help us develop in a clean way then. And that's where we have to invest in other parts of the world. And then you can look at that on a smaller scale, like I know that the Minneapolis Foundation is doing, and say, how do we do that in our own cities? You know, how do we go to poor parts of Minneapolis and say, well, if these people want solar panels, well, that's expensive. How do we do that? You know, some of us who have the means have to step in and invest in that infrastructure.
This issue of developing countries and what they're doing is a really interesting and perplexing one on this, because every school kid in the country has done some sort of project on don't tear down the rainforest. I get it. But let's step back and look at our own country. We are sitting here on the downtown riverfront, looking at the Mississippi that at one point was filled with logs coming down to the mills. That's how Minneapolis got here. And it was from deforesting the northern part of the state.
Which is supposed to last for decades, by the way. They said, the lumber barons said there'd be enough white pine up there to last for decades. And I think it took all of 9 or 10 years to wipe it all out.
Right. When you've seen some of these parts of the world, give us an example of one of those. You were talking about Namibia, and I remember seeing something you did about giraffes there. What's a particularly troubling spot you've seen on climate around the world?
I would say Borneo in Indonesia. The orangutan are one of our cousins, one of the great apes, is really one of the great apes that's at the most risk for going extinct within either our lifetime or the next generations, because they're slash and burn agriculture in Borneo. It's all rainforest, or was supposed to be, and palm oil, illegal palm oil plantations, and some that aren't legal, or some that are legal, are just wiping out the rainforest there. And they use these slash and burn techniques that I think people are familiar with in the Amazon too, for example. And rainforests are really vital carbon sinks for naturally taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, in particular there, because these are trees that are photosynthesizing year round, whereas the boreal forests of North America and Asia and Europe are huge. You can actually see animations of carbon dioxide completely decrease during our summer because the trees absorb so much in the northern forest. But that's for what? If you're lucky, a tree in Minnesota has 3 months of good, photosynthesizing, and then they sit dormant. So these year-round rainforests are really important. These are old trees too that do more than a younger tree. And it's Borneo, I'd say, but also Brazil right now. And again, getting into politics, they have a president who, he makes Trump look like a moderate, and has been opening up the forest to all these illegal loggers and slash and burn techniques. And I was just reading an article in one of our meteorological journals that was saying that the Amazon is already getting to that point where they're calling it a net zero, as far as unable to really sequester carbon any longer because the climate's changing too. Right. So, we think of, you cut down the forest, that's one thing, but eventually you hit a tipping point where now it becomes too arid because there's not enough rainforest to produce the moisture that produces the clouds, that produces the storms. And, a lot of southern and eastern parts of the Amazon have been cleared for agriculture. And that's, some of these topics of, telling people, we got to eat less meat, and people making some of these connections a little bit better, I think, are some of the things. I mean, people know that carbon dioxide's bad. It makes the earth warmer. The ice caps are melting. But I think getting to some of these things, why is native prairie? Let's look at Minnesota. To get back to our own, instead of finger pointing, we have less than 1% of Minnesota's native prairie left. And that's, you can look at our pioneer ancestor farmers as being just as bad if you want to, but it's not a good or bad thing. It's just, this is what people did, and this is what people are doing in Brazil or Indonesia or Africa now, clearing the land for agriculture. We cleared the land here for agriculture, and those tall grass lands are actually huge carbon sinks as well. And we've mutilated most of that in the United States, not to mention the biggest cultivator of them, which was, the bison. So we need to, part of the solutions is we have to sort of restore as much of this as we can, whether it's forests or some of these grasslands, and make the connection to people. I'm not a vegetarian. I was for 7 years, but you got to make meat a special occasion thing, because it's not, people think, oh, it's the cow farts is really going to warm the planet. Right. Well, yeah, methane is an issue, but the biggest thing is the amount of land and water use that goes into producing a pound of meat versus the plants, the full source. And our health will probably benefit too.
I asked you to give us something that was not working. So after depressing the heck out of us with what we need to know, give us something that's actually, that you see is actually working out there. What's some progress that you see that's taking place?
The educational element, I think, is something that has been really promising just even in the last 5 to 10 years is seeing how people are really starting to finally get it in our own country. And we need to keep pushing on that. We need to keep pushing it on adults. But there are programs, one of the many people I've gotten to meet that's been fascinating in the world is Jane Goodall. And that
must have been very
that was cool. That was cool. And one of the things talk about a hopeful inspiration, because it is easy to get depressed about this and be like, God, what can I do here at Boom Island in Minneapolis that's going to save the world? And she, before COVID, obviously, was traveling the world still 200 something days a year. So most days she's traveling to get out the word on what's happening to the planet, because she talks about her experience of going to Africa in the 60s, and she says, all those amazing things I saw don't exist anymore. Those animals are still there, but the great migrations and all these just things that we took for granted then are gone. Look at like the black rhino population in Africa. 90% of it was wiped out, not over a long period of time of European colonialization, but over really a 30-year period from the 60s to the 90s is when 90% of the black rhino population was wiped out. So she's hopeful though, because she says we don't have a lot of time. There is a narrow window, but we can still change things. And so she raises awareness and money for her institute, which does global stuff. And one of the things that they concentrate on, and this is key for conservation and climate change, is we got to not just think big picture, but helping people economically around the world. And to go back to like the black rhino population, or for her, chimps are near and dear to her. It's easy for us in the West to say, you need to save those. Shame on you for, wiping out their habitat or killing them off. But if you're just trying to feed your family, you're thinking very short term, and if somebody's offering you $1,000 for a rhino horn and you've got 4 starving kids at home, you're going to make some very difficult decisions, and we need to make sure that nobody has to make those kind of decisions. And that is where, and this is where you get into the finger pointing and what's fair or not. Is a lot of people in the West say, well, why should we? Well, we benefited from a couple hundred years of colonialization, and America was not isolated from that. So there's a lot of programs like that are boots on the ground around the world, educating but investing in communities. And Norway, the Norwegian government is, I think there's a little guilt there because Norway is one of the largest oil producers in the world with North Sea oil, but they are investing heavily in environmental projects around the world. And to go back to Brazil, they've bought up, I don't know the exact number, but thousands, if not millions of acres of Amazon rainforest and protected it. So simple things like that around the world, and there's an example of a rich country taking the initiative and saying, yes, we have the means, so we need to do something. We can't just, Norway could very easily say, we're a country of 4.5 million people up here where it's cold, a warmer world, whatever, what does that mean to us? But actually really saying, no, we need to do something. We have the means, so it's up to us to take an initiative.
So you've been around the world, but you're a lifelong Minnesotan, worked in Duluth before coming to born.
St. Cloud State, Duluth, my first job, and then back to Minneapolis. The triangle, yep.
You did it all. You've even got the perfect name for a Minnesotan, so it's great.
And people actually thought that name was made up initially when I went to TV. I'm like, no, And now I have a whole nother, speaking of the younger generation, gets a kick out of, my full name is Sven Sundgaard. Okay. So they think I'm named after Frozen characters. I'm like, no, this is way before that. Olaf Sundgaard was my great-grandpa who came over from Norway. So.
That is great. Okay, so you mentioned that about Norway. Let's talk about Minnesota, because I hear people say this, global warming, not a bad thing. I could use, 10 degrees warmer in the winter. I'm a cross-country skier. I know a little bit about what isn't happening, but what do you see happening here? And I think especially help us figure out what are some of the actions that we can be taking.
Yeah, so Minnesota, a warmer world. Some people might have a hard time complaining about warmer winters in Minnesota, but it does have impacts on other things that we, the polar bear is sort of the international mascot for climate change we think of, but I always tell people in Minnesota, we can think of the moose. That's our iconic, the largest animal in our state, and they're really at risk of disappearing. Will they go extinct from the planet? No. They'll be fine in Alaska and Canada, at least for a while, but northern Minnesota is really the southernmost part of their range. And where species like that are on the edge of where they can exist are the ones that are most vulnerable. And I sure don't want to go to the Boundary Waters or Isle Royale and not see a moose anymore. But they're really at risk. And the biggest risk, one, they overheat when it's above 55 degrees in the summer, like a Norwegian might, or above, I think it's 23 degrees in the winter. They have a thicker coat. So they're really susceptible to if you have these big swings in temperatures and just warming up things a little bit. But it also makes them more vulnerable to parasites, winter ticks. It's supposed to get down to 30, 40 below in northeastern Minnesota routinely. And that wipes out ticks on the moose. So instead, they're itching themselves on trees, spending time doing that, being irritated instead of foraging for what little food there is in the winter, and they're becoming anemic and other things. So, and not to mention, deer are moving north. A lot of people don't realize white-tailed deer are not native to the North Shore of Minnesota. They weren't there until the 1940s.
Wow.
A warmer world plus us moving in and creating optimal deer habitat, gardens, fields, farm fields, because there's nothing for them to eat in a native forest of northeastern Minnesota. And white-tailed deer carry diseases that moose are susceptible to, that white-tailed deer don't catch, like the chronic wasting disease and other things. So those are, talk about solutions, those are some things where I know the DNR and some other groups are really working to see, okay, where is there a big overlap in white-tailed deer and moose, for example? How can we prevent that? Can we have increased deer harvest in those areas, or relocate those moose to where there are fewer deer? So a lot of what we have to do is adapt to the new norm. What we've seen this year is going to be with us more and more frequently. There's nothing we can do about what we've experienced this last summer, for example. That is going to happen more. But just imagine a worse summer like this. Imagine 30 years from now that our drought is worse, or it's even hotter in the summer, or that instead of air quality alerts, 2 weeks of our summer, now it becomes an all summer thing, kind of like what California experiences.
Let me ask a rookie meteorology question about this. There's always this saying, if you don't like the weather in Minnesota, stick around, it'll change in a couple of minutes. But it actually doesn't seem like it's doing that anymore. It does seem that when we get a cold snap, it stays longer, a heat spell, it stays longer, a dry one that stays longer. That's just me observing that. Is there any truth to that, and is that part of what's going on?
You're not really a rookie then. That's a measured thing. So and we're trying. There's some exciting debate about this actually in the meteorology community about what exactly is causing that. Is it a climate change link? We think it is. There's one theory that's somewhat controversial, that we're warming the Arctic so fast that what's happening is the jet stream is becoming weaker, because the jet stream, like any wind, is created by temperature difference. Yeah. And so our mid-latitude jet stream is dependent on the difference in temperature between us and the Arctic. And if you warm the Arctic twice as fast as Minnesota's warming, which is already twice as fast as what equatorial areas are warming, now you decrease that temperature difference, and so the jet streams are becoming more wobbly, and we are getting stuck in these patterns. Okay. And it's one extreme to the next. And 3 years ago, I think it was 2018, I used this as a clear example. I didn't like the fact that it happened, but it was like, this is what's happening, and you need to see how these extremes, so it's not as clear cut as, Minnesota's just gonna have milder winters. We're gonna have more, we're an extreme place. Our extremes are becoming more extreme. We went from April 2018, people remember we had 2 blizzards, snowiest April ever, coldest April ever, to then the 4th hottest May on record. We joke about jumping from winter to summer. We literally that year went from March to June in a 30-day period, statistically. And that's, for us, it's uncomfortable, but for our plants and animals that have evolved to Minnesota's normal climate, that could be too much, a deal breaker.
When you look at a temperature map of the country, there's always this depressing trough that goes over Minnesota. Yeah. And when you look at a map, you think, is this maybe that Hudson Bay's up there and the Arctic winds are coming off Hudson Bay and coming down and making us colder? First up, why is this colder? So and how is that changing?
So there is actually, there is a climate connection.
Why is it cold in Minnesota?
There is a connect. Well, partly the basic thing I'll tell my students is pull up like a Google Map satellite view, and what do you see between us and the North Pole? What do you see? What do you see between us and the Gulf of Mexico?
Gulf of Mexico.
There's no mountains in between. There's no modifying force. Hudson Bay freezes over, even though it's saltwater because it gets so cold. So it's basically one big flat plain. So we have a free range for the coldest air on the planet to get here, but also the hottest air. And so that's why our extremes are becoming more extreme. And to get to the point that overall, though, winters are warming. Our winters are warming faster than anywhere else in the lower 48. The only place it's warming faster is Alaska because it has Arctic real estate, and the Arctic is the fastest. But a great example this February, everybody was, complaining and moaning about the 10 cold days we had in February, which were legitimately cold, but they broke no records here, which should tell people something. But everybody pointed to the climate deniers like, oh, look at all the records broken in Texas. That tells you that there's no global warming. I'm like, no, actually, think about it. How did that air, when it was here, break no records, but it's breaking records there? That tells you that air doesn't belong there. So to get back to these bizarre jet stream patterns, there are impacts that we're having on the atmosphere that we're still trying to understand. Something like that's going to be infrequent, but it doesn't matter if that happens once every 5 years and Texas doesn't get its act together, which they don't. They tend to retrograde rather than progress. That's going to be a problem for them and their whole power grid. We saw what that did. And then not to mention they get hurricanes and flooding and everything else. There's parts of the southern US which are 2 feet above normal for rainfall for the year. Whereas we had our worst drought in 33 years that finally broke. And to get back to the weather does change here, and that's why we are a little bit in a better spot than California, for example. The weather doesn't change that much, so you can get into a 10-year drought like they're in. Whereas at least here, we know summer ends. No matter what, sometimes summer will end. October, November, it doesn't matter. It's gonna catch up to us. But we just ended our hottest summer ever in the Twin Cities. And people were perplexed by, well, wait, there were more 90s and 100-degree days in 1933 and in 1988. And there were, but again, another sign of a climate change caused warm summer. We were consistently warm. 1988 had your normal variation still where you'd get a cool break for 5 days in the 70s. We didn't get anything like that. We'd get 1 or 2 days this year, maybe, or some of those coolish days you get at the beginning of June or end of August that are only in the 60s. We didn't get any of that this year, and our nights are a lot warmer. All things that show that a greenhouse effect is really amplified, and just looking at maps of the northern hemisphere comparing temperatures this year to 1988 to 1933 is really crazy because the whole northern hemisphere is hot. There are a couple little blue blobs, but that tells you there's just a lot of heat in the system. So people have been asking me, for some reason people have in their minds that when we have a hot summer we get a really cold winter. And I'm like, that's hard to imagine with the amount of heat in the northern hemisphere. You got to throw out all the old rules. The old rules go out the window. So when somebody says, oh, I heard La Niñas are cold winters, we don't get cold winters anymore. I did an analysis of the last 2 decades. Only 1 in 4 winters have been cooler than normal, and only by a degree or 2. 3/4 of our winters in the last 20 years are all warmer than normal, and by bigger margins than any of the cool winters are below normal.
Let me talk about your voice, how you use your voice. I used to be a journalist, and my job was to report and not to talk about it. And then I obviously now talk a lot about issues. You had a job on television, and now you don't. And I follow your Twitter feed. Everybody, by the way, should be on your Twitter feed. It's awesome. But it's clear. I mean, you are not pulling any punches right now. What has that meant for you? And did you feel when you were in media that you were not able to use your voice as much? And I'm especially interested in this and how so many people who are listening are trying to figure out their own voice.
Yeah.
You see a catastrophe, you want to get up and move. There are limits to what you think you can say or what's acceptable at a dinner party or whatever. What's it feel like to be able to just say it and say it clearly? And what does that insight give to the rest of us as we think about that?
I mean, the first word that comes to mind is probably pretty obvious, liberating. But we, and I have for a long time, even when I was still in TV, talked a lot about the climate change issue, even though we were always told, maybe tone it down a bit, because not that a boss disagreed with it, but it's whether you were working for a newspaper or a television station, these are for-profit companies, and they make their money based on keeping the most amount of their viewers happy or watching or reading. And so you don't want to anger, even if it's the truth, you don't want to anger certain people. So that gets into, normally that's a fine balance, but we're in these crazy times where, there are these points where everybody kind of needs to speak up a little bit, January 6th and the day after, from a political standpoint, people don't want to get political, but that's a time where people should probably be like, okay, that's wrong. There should be some accountability. And the climate change issue is one that people can't be silent anymore on it. It's just too important, and we have to do big things really quickly in order to fix it. And so I guess I look at it, do I want to get involved? Like, I wouldn't tweet anything about the mayor race or policing in Minneapolis. I'm also not an expert on that. But I do feel like in a field that I'm knowledgeable on, climate and meteorology, it's, not just should I talk about it, it's imperative that I talk about it. I'm being irresponsible if I'm not talking about, one of the biggest crises of our time. Similarly, as I would think a doctor who's an expert in immunology should be talking about COVID and vaccines and debunking, the misinformation that's out there. So should anybody be using their voice? No, but it depends on what your area of expertise is or how you want to get involved. But it doesn't have to be. You can speak up on climate change without being a climate scientist if you're, a parent says, this is an important issue and we need to do something about it. This is what the science says, not just somebody taking a pile of misinformation saying, well, we should do this because I saw this on someone's Facebook page.
Well, I'm really glad you're using your voice. It's great. Let me ask you just a final question. If somebody handed you $1,000 to give to any group that was really making an impact in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, around the world, where would you send it?
Boy, that's a good question. I'm supposed to say the Minneapolis Foundation, right?
No. We wouldn't. We get the money out to other people.
Oh, yeah. A lot of foundations go to you guys, right?
Yeah. What we often do is that somebody will say, I want to be generous. They'll open up the donor advised fund with us. Then we work with them on organizations. So I'm asking the question so that our team, when our donors say, where should they?
From an international perspective, we talked about this. The Jane Goodall Institute is really incredible, and specifically she has this Roots and Shoots program, which is specifically working with youth around the world. It's not just in developing countries, it's getting kids in Minneapolis to be appreciative of the natural world and wanting to do something about climate change and investing in their education and helping them see their potential to have an impact on the world, but also helping kids in a village somewhere in Tanzania, specifically where she was working. And it really seems like you get a lot for your money there. And I'm not just saying this, but I learned a lot by doing stories with the Minneapolis Foundation about some of the projects you guys are working on that are not, they don't work for you, but you're funding them. So the solar panel project, for example, I knew a lot about solar power and how that works, but just all the issues facing people of color, specifically when it comes to, for example, this company wants to use, whenever possible, people of color who will install the solar panels on roofs. And the problems that they run into, simple things that, where a mayor or somebody can get involved perhaps, or the city council. We used to have an electrician school that was based in Minneapolis. Now it's out in Andover or something. Well, if you don't have a car or reliable transport, how are you going to get from North Minneapolis there every single day to take the proper training to be able to get these high-paying jobs? So all these, it was supposed to be a 45-minute shoot, and I sat there for 2 hours listening and talking with, really these leaders in all this in a backyard in February, and I just thought it was inspiring to me too. And so and a little bit of money can help these different projects a lot. $1,000 isn't really a lot of money, but it actually can go a long way with some of these, especially community projects.
Great. So you gave us a great international, a great local project for so what we'll do in your name is send 500 to Jane Goodall and 500 to that local solar project. And thank you an enormous amount, Sven. Your voice right now is about as important as anybody around here. You've got a ton of credibility. You know what you're talking about. You're a Minnesotan, and it's just super critical right now. So thank you so very much for getting your voice even stronger than ever.
Thank you, and thanks for all the work you guys are doing.
Thanks.